Welcome back to Plato's Republic. This is the final video, folks. It's been quite a journey that we've been on together here through the mind of Plato and Socrates. We're always going to miss our friends Thrasymachus, Glaucon, Adeimantus, and how could you forget Cephalus? So I'm going to start out this video as promised with a review and mainly an esoteric reading, or kind of update my esoteric reading from my book 6 video where I talked about the first half of the book. So in the very first video, I said I'm going to be reading this with an esoteric eye, looking for some kind of hidden meaning in this text, and considering it with the idea that maybe there's something so dangerous Plato would be unable just to come out and say it, and that maybe the true activity of philosophy would be kind of pulling on a little thread of contradiction and unraveling something and seeing something there that maybe is not there on the surface. So do I still think that that's the case with the Republic? I do think so. I think the case is maybe a little bit weakened, maybe a little bit strengthened. So I'm gonna kind of rehash that argument. So what I said in the book 6 interpretation was that maybe Thrasymachus was right all along. So Thrasymachus had an argument about justice where he said it's the advantage of the stronger. And Socrates' refutation of that was, well, if you have that sort of definition, and if you argue that injustice is good, then you're going to have society kind of collapse on itself, or you're going to lose the morale of the soldiers if they think that they're just being strong or they're just being unjust in some way. Then they're just not going to be as effective as a society that believes itself to be just. And I pointed out at the time, wouldn't it be interesting if you had a society that believed itself to be just but was really being unjust? And by the time I got through book 5, I thought I had sufficient evidence to show that this could be the society that Socrates is constructing, this ideal Callipolis, as it's called, with the guardian class and the people all working their own jobs, and then the auxiliary guardians as the soldiers, and the complete guardians kind of making the rules or being the rational element of society. And I pointed out that in book 5, Socrates talked about sort of going to war with other societies and talked about how it was bad to attack other Greeks, but barbarians do whatever you want. And I specifically talked about the Melian dialogue, the siege of Melos, and how that had kind of influenced Greek thinking at this time, because it was sort of Greeks doing horrible things to, like, massacring other Greeks, and it was just creating a bad reputation for Greeks all around. And I pointed out that his main argument against that was sort of the PR aspect, and how that might harm the society's soft power. And while at the same time he's endorsing doing the same things, having massacres, burning houses of barbarians. And I thought it was especially interesting because he said maybe these barbarians already have an ideal society that's run by these philosopher kings, and we just don't know about it. And so in that sense, you could have this ideal society attacking and pillaging another ideal society because it needs land, and it needs land to support its luxurious lifestyle, which is kind of, in some sense, is hard to defend as being somehow just. So I thought maybe the way out of this was looking at this noble lie and saying that Socrates' definition of justice, where you have the rational element and spirited element keeping the appetites under control, maybe that is the noble lie that we need to tell the people, so that inside society everybody says, yeah, we're all very just people, and then on the outside they're kind of doing whatever they want. And people on the inside don't need to know the truth. And that's been a recurring theme, that at least people on the inside can make mistakes, they can be told these myths. And then in the second half of the book, that's, in some ways that argument is strengthened even further, that people just don't have access to the truth. So we've got the allegory of the cave in book 7, and then this long argument for why it's only the philosopher is going to have access to the truth, and everybody else is just going to be kind of living in this world of shadows and not really knowing what's going on out there. But it's the philosopher has to kind of install himself as the king and give images to the people. So I'd say that the argument for that, it's strengthened in the sense that the second half of the book, or the last 5 books of the Republic, have given kind of more tools for us to have this strong society. And it's made it even stronger. And it's increased its sort of like levels of internal deception. And in particular, I was interested by the imagery, I think in in book 9, where we finally had a sort of parable version or an image version of this idea of justice. So before it was like, well, you have a rational element and an appetitive element and a spirited element. And then Socrates says, well, let's imagine the shell of a human, and inside the shell you have another human, and you have a lion that loves victory, and you have this beast that has many heads and is just kind of out of control unless you chain it up and just feed it at appropriate feeding times. And I said that's kind of an image that's sort of a mass consumption image, and that would actually help the society, this ideal society, be even more strong. Could kind of give it another strong myth for people to believe, because most people, they're not really going to resonate with just the idea of a rational element, idea of an appetitive element, like, oh, do I have all my 3 elements in order? But if you tell them, hey, you got a human inside you have a lion inside you, which sounds kind of cool, and you have this beast inside you, I think that's something people can or will respond to, and would kind of help form this internal mythology about themselves, that they believe themselves to be just. They're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, that justice, you need the human taking charge of the lion and the beast, and here in my society we have these complete guardians kind of taking charge of the auxiliary guardians and then everybody else. So I think that would kind of make this more cohesive society by enhancing the mythology through the use of images. So that would be sort of the case for strengthening that argument that maybe we're really just constructing a strong society, and there's nothing all that just about it, at least when viewed from the outside. On the other hand, we had kind of this like M. Night Shyamalan ending to book 9, which I thought was an absolutely critical moment in the entire book. Where Socrates says it actually, after going through all this, it doesn't really matter whether the ideal city existed or not. And, I called it the Mario 2 ending, where it's like, oh, maybe it's all just a dream. But he says it's important for people to think about as they're kind of structuring their own soul. So they kind of need to believe that justice in the world is possible in order to kind of find this idea of inner peace. And that kind of transformed the book for me from one of political philosophy or political theory to like almost the self-help sort of book, which I actually liked. And I think having these images can help you think about what's going on inside of you. Because I think we can relate to this desire for victory, desire for honors, or like feeling really cool when you get an award and, walking up to the stage and accepting it. Or trying to relate to your own appetites and desires and trying to figure out, okay, how do I think about these things? Are these the real me, or is this something I need to keep under control? Or how do I proceed here? And with the use of images. And I think in some sense it is helpful at that self-help level of like, okay, here's what an ideal society does. If you want to be calm and temperate and modest and live a good life, you need to do these, here's what you need to do. And so in that sense, I think he finally does have a good refutation for the argument of Glaucon, which was, wouldn't it be best to be unjust, but be thought to be just? And he says, look, your soul is going to sort of be corrupted by this. If you go that way, you're going to give in to your appetites, and then you're going to be someone who's ruled by his appetites, and you're not going to have any friends, and you're probably just going to be kind of miserable. Honestly, I think that is kind of a compelling argument. So it's a long way getting there, but I think ultimately I do find that compelling. It's like, okay, unless I mean, it's hard to know what how universal human nature is. Like maybe there are some psychopaths who just won't find happiness any other way than stealing things and not getting caught. I don't really know, but I don't really think those people are all that happy when it comes down to it. So yeah, I find that part of Socrates' refutation of Glaucon and Thrasymachus from books 1 and 2 to be a good one, and it's similar to the almost like a Dostoevsky refutation. So in Crime and Punishment, you got this guy who sort of has this theory of why it's okay for him to kill people, and then ultimately he's just eaten alive by his conscience. And so sort of the argument, the real refutation for that theory is you say, okay, well maybe politically I can't disprove you, but human psychology is not going to allow this. So even if you're not caught and punished, you're just going to be sort of punished yourself, and maybe getting punished by society will help you find happiness because you might feel at peace again, that you kind of re-enter society and humanity. So this I see as almost like a proto-Dostoevsky argument that doing these bad things is really, really bad for your soul and is like is just not going to make you happy. But that does leave the other half of the argument about the strong society. So even if we have the idea of the just man not being a happy man, maybe it still is the case that justice in a political sense is just maybe not going to be possible. So we have I guess a couple trains of thought here. One would be that esoteric reading that maybe Thrasymachus is right. Maybe Socrates' ideal society is not actually just; it's just powerful. And then we have Socrates kind of undermining his ideal society in another way, and that's what happens in books 8 and 9, where he says, well, look, let's say you set up this aristocracy, this ideal society, and then he has this kind of stupid mathematical argument about the fertility rates and infertility rates and the magical number 12,960,000, which there's a glorious footnote about. But I think the main point of that is that even if you make this ideal aristocracy, it's just going to fall apart. Like, nothing is forever. So we have sort of the temporality of all things working against us. And so in that way, that's kind of another way of Socrates almost undermining himself, just saying, well, look, even if we could construct this thing, it's not gonna last. It's gonna devolve into timocracy, and then timocracy is not gonna last. It's gonna become oligarchy, and then it's gonna become democracy, and then it'll finally become tyranny. And so I think this is really interesting, and it just really undermines the case for sort of seeking justice out in the world, because it's like you're just building a sandcastle, and then the sandcastle is gonna fall apart. So we have these two, I guess, kind of two avenues working against the ideal society. So in that sense, it undermines the esoteric reading in the sense that maybe he's saying we don't really need, okay, let's say this ideal society wasn't just, whether it was just or not, it's not realistic. Like it's not going to last. Even if it were a good society, it's just not going to last. So maybe just the natural state of the world is going to be some form of injustice. And that could be the esoteric reading saying the ideal society actually is unjust, or at least that it's the advantage of the stronger, or that any society we make is just eventually going to fall apart, and we might not even realize it. It could sort of be like the late Roman Empire or Republic, where it looks the same on the outside, but on the inside everything has changed, and there's just no real way to know that. And so that's where I think this epistemology kind of comes back into the political, where we don't really know that. I think it's impossible to know the true nature of our own political system. It's something we have a lot of words. We're like, oh, we're a democracy, we're a republic, we're this, we're that. I think ultimately it's impossible to know where the real power is, unless you're the one wielding the real power. And he's sort of given us some hints earlier for other difficulties with that, including Thrasymachus saying, like, well, you can just overthrow a society or like use covert means to control it, and they won't know the difference. They'll think they still live in the society they had before, but really you're in charge now. So in light of that, I think that's where this makes the self-help more compelling, is that because we can't really know the true nature of the political system, maybe it's best just to look inside of us, or maybe just because we can't have any real effect on the political system. It's just you're born into the city, you're born into the nation, and it's not really yours to change. And maybe that's okay, and maybe the way to find happiness is just looking inside of yourself and getting that lion under control, getting the multi-headed beast under control, and then you can start to think about having a happy life. The last thing I'll mention before I dive into the end here is I think back to that moment where back to Cephalus once again, still my favorite character, where Socrates asks about whether Cephalus made his money or he inherited it. And I think it's interesting to think about that question, not just in terms of like, oh, how much money did you get in your inheritance? In some sense, we all inherited something. Like, we inherited a political system. You inherited, just by being born a citizen of somewhere, you inherited that society and that culture. And it is valuable. It's like, you got nice things. You have at least even if you didn't inherit any money, you have the ability to engage in a society, get a job, maybe buy a house one day, have a family, and not just be fighting all the time with everybody. Like, it's not a war of all against all. You live in a society, hopefully, where you can live a peaceful life and get the all the benefits of that. And if you think, though, about just kind of thinking back to justice, and this is an idea I got from that other book I mentioned, I've put in every single video description, Philosophy Between the Lines. And one of his arguments is that ultimately another reason no society can be just, besides sort of all the difficulties I've talked about, is that they have to. You can't have a society without land. At least, unless you count like the seasteading movement or like Elon Musk setting up shop on Mars. And land, we don't really have there's not really a satisfactory theory of the just acquisition of land. Like, most land was just taken by force at some point, either from other people or from animals, or like, there's no really satisfactory way to say that the land that you're using right now was just somehow justly acquired, and that even if it were justly acquired, why do you get to have it when other people don't? Is that any more just than abolishing inheritance or giving up your inheritance? I don't know. So I would recommend that book again, Philosophy Between the Lines. Fantastic, fascinating read. And it did give me a lot more to think about as I went through here. But maybe this ultimate state of the world is going to be injustice. At least a state of the world that makes philosophy possible. So this is sort of the other possibility, is that to have philosophy, you need these guys just walking around with a lot of free time and kind of this rich cultural heritage. And maybe the only way that comes about is if you have a society with luxury and that went to war with other societies and took their things in order to kind of beat everybody into a large society that can support a lot of people, has a lot of excess surplus, is not turning over with revolution constantly. So maybe that's just kind of this. That's kind of almost this precondition of doing philosophy, is that you live in an unjust political system, or that at least you're the benefit or beneficiary of some sort of historical injustice. So I don't know. So I like thinking about all these kind of contradictions that I think lurk in the text, and also just in any political society. This so much has just seemed so relevant to our own society, like taking land, covert operations, and everything else. So, and these just eternal things that we have inside of us as humans: loving victory, having appetites, trying to have reason and control all of them. Sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. All right. So how would I size this book up so far? Like right before getting to the end of it. Before I gave it an A+, I would. In the second half, there were a couple of these mathematical arguments I just thought were so stupid. Maybe they're parody. I can't really tell with Plato sometimes. So I would dock a couple points for that. And then we also spent a lot of time with this theory of the forms, and that was kind of the other big contribution of Plato's here. And this idea that's like, oh, when you make a couch, like you're making an image of the ideal couch. It's just not. There's not an ideal couch. This was such an influential idea for so long, like thousands of years. People were thinking about ideal couches, and it's all just language. These are just language constructs. I really wish Plato had realized that earlier. So I'm gonna dock him a couple points, even though I guess it was innovative for its time. I feel like it just set back philosophy about 2,000 years. So Plato, you lose a couple more points from me for your theory of the forms, just being patently not true, and persuading other people that it was. So I'm gonna knock him down from an A+ down to an A. But still great work, Plato. Glad you wrote this. I think you did contribute something to humanity with your book. All right, so there's my review. Launching into Book 10 now. We're in the middle of Book 10. So in the first part, we talked about the poets, and talked about how the poet was ultimately this kind of illusion maker. I was looking a little bit more at the translator's notes about this chapter. He says, well, you might think it's anticlimactic that he's just railing against poetry in Book 10, but it does serve a purpose, at least in the society where poetical education was considered the end-all. So people just studied Homer, and they're like, okay, you know everything about military sciences and math and everything you need to know because you studied poetry, and everything you need to know is in Homer. And so Socrates was just making the case like, no, stop listening to Homer. That's why he's kind of so mad about Homer this whole time, was that he was just held up as the example of the guy who knew everything, and that's all you needed to study. Socrates is saying, no, the real education is philosophical education, and maybe this musical and physical education that the philosopher prescribed. So remember from book 3 or 4, whenever that was. So we went through all the reasons that we needed to kind of dethrone Homer and install Socrates as our true king. And I did love the moment, and I guess sort of the other complication when it comes to building this truly absolute just society was Socrates' kind of own fallibility. So we've seen it a couple times with, we saw it when he got angry that people were making fun of philosophy, kind of let that lion out a little bit. And then we saw it when he's allowing the poet to plead the case for poetry. So he's like, we're banning poetry from our ideal city, but they can bring me a demo tape, and I'll try to listen and not be seduced by it. But I'm only human. I like poetry as much as the next guy. So I do like that we have this more humanized Socrates, but it does introduce the possibility for fallibility, and then maybe it'll just, like, if that guy's the king of our society, maybe he'll just end up screwing everything up because he listened to a poet when he shouldn't have, or he got angry that somebody disrespected him. I don't know. So, all right, so we're going to launch into the second half here, now that we've disposed of the poetic education. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say about that was he talked a lot about painters and kind of compared the poet to a painter. He's like, the painter doesn't know how to make a shoe. He just knows how to make a picture of a shoe. And the reason that was interesting to me was, do you remember the last time we talked about painters? This is an interesting kind of comparison. So I think the last time we talked about painters was when he was talking about the philosopher as philosopher king, and said, in order to install himself as the philosopher king, he would need to persuade people, and not only would he need to persuade them to put him in charge, but to let him clear their minds and, like, paint new things. So he said, like, we got to clean the slates of their mind, and then the philosopher has to, like, install new knowledge there, or at least new mythology there. I thought that was really fascinating, because that was just sort of the ultimate kind of mind programming, like, Socrates is going to put everybody into the Matrix. But he compared himself to a painter then. So that's interesting, that here he's saying, like, well, a painter is just like the poet. Well, the painter is also like the philosopher. And so the implication there from this kind of making fun of painters in Book 10 would be that maybe he's the guy kind of painting in people's minds. Maybe he doesn't really know what he's doing. And maybe he doesn't actually have mastery of all these subjects. So maybe he's just kind of putting these false images in people's heads. Maybe that's for the good of society, because you need people laboring under mythology and essentially false images in order to have society kind of operate and agree on everything and go to war together. Or maybe he's just going to kind of screw everything up because he doesn't really know what he's doing. So, again, I enjoy these kind of, this level of, like, almost self-deprecation that either Plato has or Socrates has. The other big one being, it's like, oh, we can't allow these imitators, and, like, Plato is just writing imitations for the entire book. All right, so that was the last little bit I wanted to bring up there, the role of the painter. And now, at long last, second half of Book 10, we will prove that the soul is immortal. Okay, so Glaucon said, all you have to do is speak. See how Socrates goes about this one. Socrates, do you think there's a good and a bad? I do. And do you think about them the same way I do? What way? What destroys and corrupts coincides entirely with the bad, while what preserves and benefits coincides entirely with the good. And we talked about the good a little bit. I'm not sure if it's the same word here. Or we talked about it a lot, because the good was like the sun outside the cave that kind of allowed for true knowledge about things. I had no idea what he was talking about, and I kind of wonder if it's the same good that we have here, which is preserving and benefiting. All right, Glaucon says, I do. Socrates, and do you think there is a good and a bad for each thing, such as ophthalmia for the eyes, sickness for the whole body, blight for grain, rot for wood, rust for iron and bronze, and, as I say, a natural badness and sickness for nearly everything? Glaucon, I certainly do. And when one of them attaches itself to something, doesn't it make the thing to which it attaches itself deficient? And in the end, doesn't it break it down completely and destroy it? Okay, so we've got whatever thing there is, there's something that destroys it. Glaucon, of course. I hope he doesn't bring the forms back into this. Socrates, so the badness natural to each thing, the deficiency peculiar to each, destroys it. But if that does not destroy it, there is nothing else left to destroy it. For obviously, the good will never destroy anything, and again, what is neither good nor bad won't either. Okay, here's another word game. It's like, oh, well, it's bad because it destroys, so nothing besides the bad can destroy, because we just said that it was the bad that destroys. Glaucon, how could it? Socrates, so, if we discover something, the badness of which causes it to deteriorate, but cannot break it down and destroy it, won't we immediately know that something with such a nature cannot be destroyed after all? Okay. Alright, so here's our circular definition at work. Glaucon, that seems reasonable. Well then, what about the soul? Isn't there something that makes it bad? Ah, yeah, I'd say the appetites being in charge would make it bad, wouldn't you? Glaucon, certainly. All the things we were discussing earlier. Injustice, intemperance, cowardice, ignorance. Socrates, do any of these break it down and destroy it? Think about it. So we are not deceived into believing that when an unjust and foolish person is caught, he is destroyed by injustice, which is a deficiency in a soul. Instead, let's proceed this way. Just as the body's deficiency, which is disease, wastes and destroys a body, and brings it to the point of not being a body at all, so all the things we mentioned just now reach the point of not being when their own peculiar badness attaches itself to them, is present in them, and destroys them. Isn't that so? Okay, all these bad things can basically just kill you, or whatever it is that they attach themselves to. Glaucon, yes. Socrates, come on then, and look at the soul in the same way. When injustice and the rest of the vices are present in it, is their presence in it and attachment to it corrupt and wither it until they bring it to the point of death and separate it from the body? Glaucon, no, they never do that. Ah, okay. So you're not... All these vices don't actually kill you. They just make you miserable. Socrates, but surely it is unreasonable to suppose that a thing is destroyed by something else's deficiency and not by its own. Okay, so it's like, well, that's its deficiency, and nothing else can destroy it, so it's eternal. I think that's where we're going. It is unreasonable, says Glaucon. Think about it, Glaucon. We do not even believe that a body would be destroyed by the deficiency belonging to foods, whether it is staleness, rottenness, or anything else. But if the food's own deficiency induces bodily deterioration, we will say the body was destroyed through them by its own badness, which is disease. Okay, so it's like you eat a bad hamburger. You can't really blame the thing that was bad to the hamburger. You gotta blame the disease that you get from the hamburger. But we will never admit that the body is destroyed by the deficiency belonging to foods, so whatever makes the hamburger deficient as a hamburger, since they and the body are different things, except when external badness induces the natural badness. I don't know what that's about, the external badness. Glaucon, that's absolutely right. By the same argument, then, if the body's deficiency does not induce a soul's own deficiency in a soul, we will never admit that a soul is destroyed by external badness in the absence of its own peculiar deficiency. One thing by another's badness. Okay, so I guess the external one is whatever makes the hamburger bad is the external badness. We don't say that that's destroyed by the deficiency. No. Okay, and listen, induces. I don't see this distinction here because he's saying, it's like, oh, you're just destroyed by the disease, not the thing that made the bad hamburger. But then he's saying, well, we don't admit that except when the external badness induces the natural badness, which I guess is the kind of the native badness. Okay, so similarly, these bodily deficiencies don't induce deficiency in your soul. So we say the soul cannot be destroyed by external badness unless it's the soul's badness that's doing it. You get that? So now the body is the hamburger and the soul is the body. You see what I'm saying. Glaucon, yes, that's reasonable. Well then, let's refute these arguments and show what we said was not right. Wait a minute. Or, so long as they remain unrefuted, let's never say that the soul even comes close to being destroyed by a fever or any other disease, or by killing for that matter. Not even if one were to cut the entire body up into the very smallest pieces. He's got a pretty dark turn of mind. Until someone demonstrates to us that these conditions of the body make the soul itself more unjust and more impious. But when an external badness is present, while its own particular badness is absent, let's not allow anyone to say that a soul or anything else, whatever, is destroyed. Okay, so all this stuff that makes your body bad can't touch your soul unless it's making something in your soul bad. But then we already said the soul can't be destroyed. Or something. I forgot what we said. I don't know, this whole line of argument I'm already tired of. Glaucon, but you may be sure no one will ever prove that the souls of the dying are made more unjust by death. But suppose someone dares to come to grips, says Socrates, with our argument, and, simply in order to avoid having to agree that our souls are immortal, dares to say that a dying man does become worse and more unjust. We are sure to reply that if what he says is true, injustice must be as deadly as a disease to those who have it, and that those who catch it must die because of its own deadly nature. with the worst cases dying quickly and the less serious ones more slowly, and not as now in fact happens where the unjust are put to death because of their injustice by others who inflict the penalty. Okay, so, we say that, we reply that it's a deadly disease. It's like, oh yeah, in that case it must be the injustice that's killing you if the dying man is becoming more unjust. Whatever. Glaucon, by Zeus, injustice won't seem so altogether terrible if it will be deadly to the person who contracts it, since then it would be an escape from evils. But I am more inclined to think that it will be shown to be entirely the opposite. Something that kills others if it can, but makes its possessor very lively indeed. And not just lively, but positively sleepless. That's how far it is, in my view, from being deadly. So the injustice, it makes the possessor lively. Oh, positively sleepless. I guess because it's like, yeah, you're Raskolnikov, you've done a terrible thing, you can't sleep at night. You're losing your mind. You're like Macbeth. Socrates, you are right. After all, if its own deficiency, its own badness, is not enough to kill and destroy the soul, an evil design for the destruction of something else will hardly destroy the soul, or anything else except what it is designed to destroy. Who's doing the designing here, Socrates? Glaucon, hardly is right, it seems. Socrates, then, when something is not destroyed by a single bad thing, whether its own or an external one, clearly it must always exist. And if it always exists, it is immortal. I'm just gonna breeze through this. This is just a word game as far as I'm concerned. Glaucon, it must be. Well then, let's assume it to be so. And if it is so, you realize that the same ones will always exist. I mean, they surely could not become fewer in number if none is destroyed, or more numerous either. For if anything immortal is increased, you know that the increase would have to come from the mortal, and then everything would end up being immortal. That's actually a pretty good argument. It's like, well, if it's immortal, then it can't have a beginning. You're saying it can't have an end, but then if it can't have an end, it also can't have a beginning. So, because the immortal thing would have to come from a mortal thing. So how's that going to happen? Okay, so now, therefore, these souls are eternal. Hooray! I see why those medieval scholastics were all over Plato. Like, yeah, that's what we've been talking about this whole time. Eternal souls. Glaucon, true. Socrates, then we must not think such a thing, for our argument does not allow it. We must not think either that the soul in its truest nature is full of multicolored variety and dissimilarity in conflict with itself. How do you mean? It is not easy for something to be immortal when it is composed of many elements and is not composed in the most beautiful way, which is how the soul now seemed to us. It probably isn't. Oh boy, it's beautiful and eternal. Socrates, yet both our recent argument and others as well require us to accept that the soul is immortal. But what it is like in truth, seen as it should be, not maimed by its partnership with the body and other bad things, which is how we see it now, what it is like when it has become pure, that we can adequately see only by means of rational calculation. Oh boy, I hope there's a really large number involved. And you will find it to be a much more beautiful thing than we thought, and get a much clearer view of all the cases of justice and injustice, and of all the other things that we have so far discussed. So far, what we have said about the soul is true of it as it appears at present. But the condition we have seen it in is like that of all the sea god Glaucus, whose original nature cannot easily be made out by those who catch glimpses of him, because some of the original parts of his body have been broken off, others have been worn away and altogether mutilated by the waves, and other things, shells, seaweeds, and rocks, have grown into him, so that he looks more like any wild beast than what he naturally is. I will look at this footnote, because this is kind of a cool image of this big god body broken up and covered in barnacles. Ancient paintings may have represented Glaucus in the way Plato describes him here. His name appears in the accusative Glaucon, suggesting a play on Glaucon. Glaucon versus Glaucon. I don't know what the little carrot's doing there. Maybe someone can fill us in. Okay. But, Glaucon, we should be looking at another... No. Okay, such too is the condition of the soul when we see it beset by myriad bad things. But, Glaucon, we should be looking in another direction. Okay, so when your soul's beset by evils, it's just like Glaucus covered in shells and having his limbs broken off. Poor fella. Glaucon, where? Socrates, 2, it's love of wisdom. Hooray, the soul loves wisdom. Oh, come on. Alright, click in the footnote. Finding inner peace. Finding inner peace. Okay, I click. There it is. Philosophia. Thank you, C.D.C. Reeve. We must keep in mind what it grasps and the kinds of things with which it longs to associate, because it is akin to what is divine and immortal and what always exists, and what it would become if it followed this longing with its whole being, and if that impulse lifted it out of the sea in which it is now, and struck off the rocks and shells that, because it now feasts on earth, have grown around it in a wild, earthy, and stony profusion as a result of these so-called happy feastings. And then you would see its true nature, whether multiform or uniform, or somehow some other way. But we have given a pretty good account now, I think, of what its condition is and what form it takes in human life. Okay. So it's wisdom is going to strike off all the rocks and things. That's a beautiful thought. Glaucon, we certainly have. In the course of our discussion, then, did we respond to the other points without having to invoke the rewards and reputations of justice, as you all said Homer and Hesiod did? Okay, that was Glaucon and Adeimantus' argument back in Book 2. It was people just want the external benefits, not justice in itself. Instead, haven't we found that justice itself is the best thing for the soul itself, and that the soul should do what is just, whether it has Gyges' ring or not? Ah, yeah, remember that? Or even the cap of Hades as well. Footnote. I don't remember the cap of Hades. That sounds cool, though. Oh, also made its wearer invisible. Alright. So, something else in your role-playing game. Okay, Glaucon. That's absolutely true. We have. Yeah. So, Glaucon, isn't it now at last unobjectionable, in addition, also to give back to justice and the rest of virtue both the kind and quantity of wages they bring to the soul, both from human beings and from gods, both during life and after death? Okay, so it pays to be good. Certainly. Then will you give me back what you borrowed from me in the course of the discussion? What is this? I do like how it's now coming full circle. Like, Book 10 is a bookend on Book 1, although I'm still waiting for Cephalus. Glaucon, what in particular? Socrates, I granted you that the just man should seem unjust and the unjust one just. For you thought that even... Okay, remember we have, like, secret, like, Hitler-Gandhi and Gandhi-Hitler. For you thought that even if it would be impossible for these things to remain hidden from both gods and human beings, all the same, it had to be granted for the sake of argument so that justice itself could be judged in relation to injustice itself. Don't you remember? I remember. I would be unjust if I didn't, says Glaucon. Socrates, well, then, since they have now been judged, I ask on behalf of justice for a return of the reputation it in fact has among gods and human beings, and that we agree that it does indeed have such a reputation, and so may carry off the prizes it gains for someone by making him seem just, since we have already seen that it does give the good things that come from being just, and does not deceive those who really possess it. Does not deceive those who really possess it. Yeah, I don't... This is a weird argument. It's like, oh, okay, so justice makes you happy in your soul because it doesn't corrupt your soul. So we got to bring its reputation back. And now everyone else needs to know that you're just. It seems like a little sleight of hand here. Glaucon, that's a just request. Socrates, then won't you first give this back, that it certainly does not remain hidden from the gods what each of the two is like? Yeah, can't hide anything from the gods. We will. But if it does not remain hidden, one would be loved by the gods and one hated, as we agreed at the beginning. That's right. And won't we also agree that everything that comes to the one who is loved by gods, insofar as it comes from the gods themselves, is the best possible, unless it is some avoidable bad thing due to him for an earlier mistake? Earlier mistake? What is that about? Foreshadowing of the doctrine of reincarnation introduced below. Ooh, reincarnation's coming our way. Glaucon, certainly. And we did hear a little bit about reincarnation. He's like, well, if my arguments don't persuade you, maybe when you die and come back in another life, I think he's talking to Thrasymachus, then you'll be persuaded. Like, you'll read the Republic, be like, my God, this guy was a genius. Like, maybe you are a reincarnated version of Thrasymachus, dear reader. Socrates, similarly, we must suppose that if a just man falls into poverty or disease, or some of the other things that seem bad, it will end well for him during his lifetime, or even in death. For surely the gods at least will never neglect anyone who eagerly wishes to become just, and by practicing virtue to make himself as much like a god as a human being can. So now I guess the gods are rewarding the guy for being just. Okay, sure, Socrates. Glaucon, it is certainly reasonable to think that a man of that sort won't be neglected by one who is like him. Socrates. I mean, all this stuff so far, this is only interesting if this is part of the mythology. Because this is not a real proof that a soul exists and is immortal, and the gods are going to reward you for being or that gods exist, or any of this stuff. So it's like, it's either bad philosophy or good propaganda. I'm not sure which one, but I'm not like spending too much time with the argument here. That's if you notice, I feel like I'm phoning in a little bit with this book. That's the reason why. Okay. Socrates, and mustn't we think the opposite of the unjust one? Glaucon, definitely. Socrates, those, then, are the sorts of prizes that come from the gods to the just man. Hooray! Glaucon, that's certainly what I believe. Socrates, what about from human beings? What does a just man get from them? If we are to assert what is really the case, isn't it this? Aren't clever but unjust men precisely like runners, who run well on the first leg but not on the return one? They leap away sharply at first, but in the end they become ridiculous, and, heads drooping, run off the field uncrowned. I do like that image. True runners, on the other hand, make it to the end, collect the prizes, and are crowned as victors. Okay, so it's like, well, in the long run, justice is always rewarded. Do the right thing. I mean, maybe that's right. Hard to say, but it's a cool image of like, yeah, you got to be a distance runner. Be good, folks. And isn't it also generally what happens to just people? Toward the end of each course of action and association and of life as a whole, don't they enjoy a good reputation and collect the prizes that come from human beings? I mean, yeah, maybe, but we don't really know the true nature of anybody, so I don't know how you can make this argument. And then maybe it's just we got these ideas from the poets or from the stories and mythology of our society that wants us to be good and not rip other people off. Glaucon, of course. Socrates, will you then allow me to say about them what you said about the unjust? For I will claim that it is the just who, when they are old enough, hold the ruling offices in their cities if they choose, marry from whatever family they choose, and give their children in marriage to whomever they please. Indeed, all the things that you said about the others, I now say about these. As for the unjust, the majority of them, even if they remain hidden when they are young, are caught by the end of the race and ridiculed, and by the time they get old have become wretched and are showered with abuse by foreigners and citizens, beaten with whips, and made to suffer those punishments you rightly described as crude, such as racking and burning. Imagine I have claimed that they suffer all such things. Well, as I say, see if you will stand for it. But this also relies on a certain definition of the society. Like, it seems like this would only be the case, first of all, if you can ever know the true nature of somebody. Second, if you live in a society that will do these things and you don't live in a tyranny, for instance, where like all these unjust dudes are the bodyguards of the tyrant. Because we never really have the collapse of the tyrannical society. I don't think that was ever really described. Like, I thought it'd be cool if the tyranny collapses into aristocracy, so you get like this infinite loop of societies. But if anything, it's like maybe the tyranny is the only like stable society or the only eternal society. I don't know. Whatever. Glaucon, of course I will. What you say is right. Socrates, well then, while the just man is alive, these are the sorts of prizes, wages, and gifts he receives from gods and human beings, in addition to those good things that justice itself provides. Okay, crime doesn't pay, boys and girls. Be good. Glaucon, fine and secure ones they are too. Socrates, well, they are nothing in number or size, compared to those that await each man after death. Okay, now this is getting interesting. Now it's getting interesting. So the reason is, because all this stuff, I'm like, okay, yeah, what? Okay, yeah, great. It's justice is always rewarded. But what does this remind you of? What awaits you after death? Where did we hear this before? Anybody remember? Can anybody want to raise their hand? When have we talked to you about rewards waiting for people after death? Book 3. I think it's book 3. When we're talking about the guardians. And what do we tell the guardians? We tell them, we go to the poets and say, you need to stop talking about how bad death is, because we need the guardians, we need to change the behavior of the guardians. We need them to be braver in battle. So basically we need to lie to them about Hades and dying. And say, oh, yeah, it's not so bad. If you're courageous in battle, you'll have a glorious afterlife. Now here he's telling us that and there are a lot of rewards after you die. So this kind of makes all that preceding stuff I thought was really boring. Oh yeah, the gods are going to reward you. Everybody knows that. Like, oh yeah, nobody ever gets away with a crime. Everybody knows that. But now this is like a direct analogy to a myth or a noble lie we were telling the guardians in the ideal city. So that kind of lights this previous part up for me as maybe just being propaganda. That maybe this is one of the lies we just need to tell people so that they behave in a good way and society doesn't collapse. So I'm finally like interested in this chapter again, or in book 10 again. Okay, let's see what happens with what all these rewards waiting for us after death. We must hear about them so that by hearing them, each of these men may get back in full what he is owed by the argument. Glaucon, please describe them then, since there are not many things that would be more pleasant to hear. This almost gets back to the poetry thing of just like being pleasing to the ear rather than being true. Socrates, well, it's not an Alcinous story I'm going to tell you, but that of a brave man called the son of Arminius, by a race of Pamphylian. Gonna check out the note. I think this is a famous passage too, but I don't remember it at all. Alright, let's read this. Let's read the note here. Books 9 through 11 of the Odyssey were traditionally referred to as the Alcinu Apologoi, the Tales of Alcinous. Included among them is the story in Book 11 of Odysseus' descent into Hades. Ooh. Since the word translated by brave is Alcamu, which is very similar to Alcanu, some sort of pun seems to be involved. The following is one attractive way to interpret it. Alcanu might be taken as a compound of alke, strength, and nous, understanding, and alcamu as a compound of alke, strength, and musa, a muse. Socrates would then be saying something like, it isn't a tale that shows strength of understanding that I'm going to tell you, but one that shows the strength of the muse of storytelling. Interesting. So I'm glad I read that footnote. So this is again kind of getting to poetry or propaganda versus philosophy or true knowledge. And before he's like, I got to get rid of these poets. I hate these poets. But then he's like, well, maybe we do need the poet. Maybe we do need a triumph of the muse here to tell us either the truth or a version of the truth that keeps society intact. Okay, where was that footnote? Okay, once upon a time, was killed in battle. On the 10th day, when the rest of the dead were picked up, they were already putrefying. But he was picked up still quite sound. When he had been taken home and was lying on the pyre before his funeral on the 12th day, he revived, and after reviving, told what he had seen in the other world. I love this. He said that when his soul had departed, it traveled together with many others and came to a demonic place. This is like, wasn't there like a book called Heaven is Real a couple years ago? Some kid who was like medically dead for like 3 minutes, and he's like, "Oh, I saw heaven. Let me write a book about it," even though I'm 8 years old. Where there were 2 adjacent openings in the earth and 2 in the heavens above and opposite them. Okay, let's map this out. So he comes to the demonic place. Remember, that's like a demon is like halfway between a god and a human. So 2 adjacent openings in the earth and 2 in the heavens above. All right, 2 holes in the ground, 2 in the sky. Judges were seated between these, and when they had made their judgments, they told the just to go to the right up through the heavens, with signs of the judgments attached to their fronts. But the unjust they told to travel to the left and down, and they too had on their backs all of their deeds. When he himself came forward, they said that he was to be a messenger to human beings to tell them about the things happening there, and they told him to listen to and look at everything in the place. Through one of the openings in the heavens and one in the earth, he saw souls departing after judgment had been passed on them. Through the other 2, they were arriving. Okay, so through one, so souls are departing. The just people are going into one hole in the sky, and then I guess just people are coming down from the other hole. And then same thing on the earth. Some are departing and some are arriving. From the one in the earth, they came up parched and dusty, while from the one in the heavens, they came down pure. And the ones that had just arrived seemed to have come from a long journey, and went off gladly to the meadow, like a crowd going to a festival. Isn't that interesting? The festival! That was the very first image we had in the entire book. And set up camp there. Those that knew one another exchanged greetings, and those coming up from the earth asked the others about the things up there, while those from the heavens asked about the others' experiences. It's like, yeah, which one were you in? Which tent did you go to? They told their stories to one another, the former weeping and lamenting as they recollected all they had suffered and seen on their journey below the earth, which lasted 1,000 years, and the ones from heaven telling, in turn, about their happy experiences and the inconceivably beautiful sights they had seen. To tell it all, Glaucon, would take a long time. But the gist, he said, was this. For all the unjust things he had done and for all the people they had wronged, they had paid the penalty for every one in turn 10 times over for each. That is to say, they paid for each injustice once in every 100 years of their journey, so that, on the assumption that 100 years is roughly the length of a human life, they paid a 10-fold penalty for each injustice. For example, if some of them had caused many deaths or had betrayed cities or armies or reduced them to slavery, or had taken part in other evil-doing, they would receive 10 times the pain for each of them. On the other hand, if they had done good deeds and become just and pious, they received commensurate awards. He said some other things about the stillborn and those who lived only for a short time, but they are not worth recounting. And he told of even greater wages for impiety or piety toward gods or parents, and for murder. He said he was there, you see, when someone asked where the great Ardiaeus was. This Ardiaeus had been a tyrant in a city in Pamphylia just 1,000 years before that, and was said to have killed his aged father and older brother and committed many other impious deeds as well. He said the one who was asked responded, "He has not come here and never will. For in fact this too was one of the terrible sights we saw. When we were near the mouth about to come up after all our sufferings were over, we suddenly saw Ardiaeus, together with some others, almost all of whom were tyrants, although there were also some private individuals among them who had committed great crimes. They thought that they were about to go up, but the mouth would not let them through. Instead, it roared whenever one of these incurably bad people, or anyone else, who had not paid a sufficient penalty, tried to go up. At that location there were savage men, all fiery to look at, standing by, paying attention to the sound, who grabbed some of these people and led them away. In the case of Ardiaeus and others, they bound their feet, hands, and neck, and threw them down and flayed them. They dragged them along the road outside, lacerating them on thorn bushes. They explained to those who were passing by at the time why they were being dragged away, and said that they were to be thrown into Tartarus. He said that of the many and multifarious fears they experienced there, the greatest each of them had was that the sound would be heard as he came up, and that each was very pleased when it was silent as he went up. Such then were the penalties and punishments, and the rewards that were their counterparts. When each group had spent 7 days in the meadow, on the 8th they had to move on from there and continue their journey. In 4 days they came to a place where they could see, stretching from above, through the whole heaven and earth, a straight beam of light, like a column, very closely resembling a rainbow, but brighter and more pure. They reached the beam after traveling another day's journey, and there in the middle of the light they saw stretching from the heavens the ends of its bonds, for this light is what binds the heavens like cables under a trireme, thus holding the entire revolving thing together. From those ends hangs the spindle of necessity, by means of which all the revolving things are turned. Its shaft and hook were adamant, while its whorl was adamant, mixed with materials of other kinds. The nature of the whorl was as follows. Its shape was like the ones here on earth, but from Ur's description we must think of it as being like this. In one great whorl, hollow and scooped out, lay another just like it, only smaller, that fitted into it exactly the way nested bowls fit together, and similarly a third and a fourth, and 4 others. For there were 8 whorls altogether, lying inside one another, with their rims appearing as circles from above, while from the back they formed one continuous whirl around the shaft, which is driven right through the center of the 8th. Now, the first or outermost whorl had the broadest circular rim. That of the 6th was second, 3rd was that of the 4th, 4th that of the 8th, 5th that of the 7th, 6th that of the 5th, 7th that of the 3rd, 8th that of the 2nd. That of the greatest was spangled, that of the 7th was brightest, that of the 8th took its color from the 7th shining on it. That of the 2nd and 5th were very similar to one another, being yellower than the rest. The 3rd was the whitest in color, the 4th was reddish, and the 6th was second in whiteness. The spindle as a whole revolved at the same speed, but within the revolving hole the 7 inner circles gently revolved in the opposite directions to the hole. Of these the 8th moved fastest. Second, and at the same speed as one another, were the 7th, 6th, and 5th. Third, it seemed to them, in the speed of its counter-revolution, was the 4th. 4th was the 3rd, and 5th the 2nd. The spindle revolved on the lap of necessity. On top of each of its circles stood a siren who was carried around by its rotation, emitting a single sound, one single note. And from all 8 in concord a single harmony was produced. And there were 3 other women seated around it, equidistant from one another, each on a throne. They were the daughters of necessity, the Fates, dressed in white with garlands on their heads, Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos. And they sang to the accompaniment of the siren's harmony, Lachesis singing of the past, Clotho of the present, and Atropos of the future. Clotho, using her right hand, touched the outer circumference of the spindle and helped it turn, pausing from time to time. Atropos with her left did the same to the inner ones, and Lachesis used each hand in turn to touch both. When the souls arrived, they had to go straight to Lachesis. The sort of spokesman first arranged them in ranks. Then, taking lots of models of lives from the lap of Lachesis, he mounted a high platform and said, "The word of Lachesis, maiden daughter of necessity, ephemeral souls, the beginning of another death-bringing cycle for mortal kind. Your demon will not be assigned to you by lot. You will choose him. The one who has the first lot will be the first to choose a life to which he will be bound by necessity. Virtue has no master. As he honors or dishonors it, so shall each of you have more or less of it. Responsibility lies with the chooser. The god is blameless." After saying that, the spokesman threw the lots out among them all, and each picked up the one that fell next to him, except for who was not allowed. And to the one who picked it up, it was clear what number he had drawn. After that again the spokesman placed the models of lives on the ground before them, many more of them than those who were present. They were multifarious. All animal lives were there, as well as all human lives. There were tyrannies among them, some lifelong, others ending halfway through poverty, exile, and beggary. There were lives of famous men, some famous for the beauty of their appearance or for their older strengths or athletic prowess, others for their nobility and the virtues of their ancestors, and also some infamous in these respects, and similarly for women. But the structure of the soul was not included, because with the choice of a different life it would inevitably become different. But all the other qualities were mixed with each other and with wealth or poverty, sickness or health, or the states in between. Here it seems, my dear Glaucon, a human being faces the greatest danger of all, and because of that, each must, to the neglect of all subjects, take care above all else to be a seeker and student of that subject which will enable him to learn and discover who will give him the ability and the knowledge to distinguish a good life from a bad, so that he will always and in any circumstances choose the better one from among those that are possible. He must calculate the effect of all the things we have mentioned just now, both jointly and severally, on the virtue of a life, so as to know what the good and bad effects of beauty are when it is mixed with wealth or poverty in this or that state of the soul. What the effects are of high and low birth, private lives and ruling offices, physical strength and weaknesses, ease and difficulties in learning, and all the things that are either naturally part of the soul or can be acquired by it when they are mixed with one another. On the basis of all that, he will be able, by considering the nature of the soul, to reason out which life is better and which is worse, and choose accordingly, calling worse the one that will lead the soul to become more unjust, and better the one that leads it to become more just. Everything else he will ignore, for we have seen that it is the best way to choose, whether in life or death. Holding this belief with adamantine determination, he must go down to Hades, so that even there he won't be dazzled by wealth and other such evils, and won't rush into tyrannies or other similar practices, or so commit irreparable evils and suffer even greater ones. But instead will know to choose the middle life in such circumstances, and avoid either of the extremes, both in this life so as far as is possible, and in the whole of the life to come. For this is how a human being becomes happiest. At that point our messenger from the other world also reported that the spokesman said this: "Even for the one who comes last, if he chooses wisely and lives earnestly, there is a satisfactory life available, not a bad one. Let not the first to choose be careless, nor the last discouraged." When the spokesman had told them that, said, "The one who drew the first lot came up and immediately chose the greatest tyranny. In his foolishness and greed, you see, he chose it without adequately examining everything, and did not notice that it involved being fated to eat his own children, among other evils. When he examined the life at leisure, however, he beat his breast and bemoaned his choice, ignoring the warning of the spokesman. For he did not blame himself for these evils, but chance, demons, and everything except himself. He was one of those who had come down from heaven, having lived his previous life in an orderly constitution, sharing in virtue through habit, but without philosophy. Generally speaking, not the least number of the people caught out in this way were souls who came from heaven, and so were untrained in sufferings. The majority of those from earth, on the other hand, because they had suffered themselves and had seen others doing so, were in no rush to make their choices. Because of that, and also because of the chance of the lottery, there was an exchange of evils and goods for most of the souls. Yet, if a person, whenever he came to the life that is here, always practiced philosophy in a sound manner, and if the fall of the lot did not put his choice of life among the last, it is likely, from what was reported by about the next world, that not only will he be happy here, but also that his journey from here to there and back again will not be underground and rough, but smooth and through the heavens. He said it was a sight worth seeing how the various souls chose their lives, since seeing it caused pity, ridicule, and surprise. For the most part, their choice reflected the character of their former life. He saw the soul that had once belonged to Orpheus, he said, choosing a swan's life. He hated the female sex because of his death at their hands, and so was unwilling to be conceived in a woman and born. He saw the soul of Thamyris choosing a nightingale's life, a swan changing to the choice of a human life, and other musical animals doing the same. The 20th soul chose the life of a lion. It was that of Ajax, son of Telamon, who avoided human life because he remembered the judgment about the armor. The next was that of Agamemnon, which also hated the human race on account of what it suffered, and so changed to the life of an eagle. Allotted a place in the middle, the soul of Atalanta, when it saw the great honors of a male athlete, unable to pass them by, chose his life. After her he saw the soul of Appius, son of Panopeus, taking on the nature of a craftswoman. Further on, among the last, he saw the soul of the ridiculous Thersites clothing itself as an ape. Now it chanced that Odysseus' soul drew the last lot of all and came to make its choice. Remembering its former sufferings, it rejected love of honor and went around for a long time looking for the life of a private individual who did his own work, and with difficulty found one lying off somewhere neglected by the others. When it saw it, it said that it would have done the same even if it had drawn the first place lot, and chose it gladly. Similarly, souls went from the other animals into human beings or into one another, the unjust changing into savage animals, the just into tame ones, and every sort of mixture occurred. When all the souls had chosen lives, in the same allotted order they went forward to Lachesis. She assigned to each the daemon it had chosen, as guardian of its life and fulfiller of its choices. This daemon first led the soul under the hand of Clotho, as it turned the revolving spindle, thus ratifying the allotted fate it had chosen. After receiving her touch, he led the soul to the spinning of Atropos, to make the spun fate irreversible. Then, without turning around, it went under the throne of necessity. When it had passed through that, and when the others had also passed through, they all traveled to the plain of Lethe, through burning and choking and terrible heat, for it was empty of trees and earthly vegetation. They camped, since evening was coming on, beside the river of forgetfulness, whose water no vessel can hold. All of them had to drink a certain measure of this water. But those not saved by wisdom drank more than the measure. And as each of them drank, he forgot everything. When they were asleep and midnight came, there was a clap of thunder and an earthquake, and they were suddenly carried away from there, this way and that, up to their berths like shooting stars. But himself was prevented from drinking the water. Yet how or where he had come back to his body he did not know, but suddenly recovering his sight, he saw now himself lying on the pyre at dawn. And so Glaucon, his story was saved and not lost, and it would save us too, if we were persuaded by it, since we would safely cross the river Lethe with our souls undefiled. But if we are persuaded by me, we will believe that the soul is immortal and able to endure every evil and also every good, and also uphold to the upward path, practicing justice with wisdom every way he can, so that we will be friends to ourselves and to the gods, both while we remain here on earth and when we receive the rewards of justice, and go around like victors in the games collecting prizes. And so both in this life and on the 1,000-year journey we have described, we will fare well. Wow! That was amazing. Plato, you get an A+. I'm giving you your A+ back. The Myth of I had heard about this, but I didn't know it was just that incredible. So that was like a poem and a myth and a theory of justice and ethics and morality all kind of rolled into one, and this just beautifully rendered passage. I didn't want to interrupt it because it was just the cadence, the timing, the rhythm, just everything about it just like flowed so wonderfully. And my hat's off to C.D.C. Reeve for that English translation, because I just loved reading that so much, and just the spindle and the fates and the holes in the sky and then the ground. There's it just seems so rich. I don't feel qualified really to comment on it too much. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of perspective here. I don't want to say too much about this because I almost don't feel equal to this myth here. The first thing I guess I'd say I want to bring this back to Cephalus once again, and first just talking about how Cephalus, the reason he was happy to have money was that he could do the right thing and he wasn't afraid of Hades anymore. And we kind of make fun, like, oh, haha, you believe in Hades and that what you need to do, like, the only motivation you have, you're not a true philosopher, you're just kind of believing these myths about the afterlife. And now here's Socrates bringing us a very richly drawn vision of the afterlife, which includes suffering if you commit injustice. And so this is the exact sort of myth that Cephalus would have feared and would have motivated his behavior in this world. And it is, you remember in book 3 when we're like, all he had done before was like stricken out poetry. He's like, oh yeah, the poet says that, get rid of that. Oh, the poet uses this meter, get rid of this. And now this is like Plato's poetry. And I mean, I don't know how it was rendered in the Greek, but this is his version of doing, is finally giving us his own poem, saying this is the myth. This is the myth of and this, in some sense, these are the lies we need to tell the guardians, or even tell the regular person, so that they will lead these good lives, perhaps. And he has a role for philosophy there too. He says, like, the philosopher is like that person looking down at the different lives. They're able to see further. Ultimately, philosophy is about the good life, more so than trying to establish justice on earth. And, oh man, I love that vision with the spindles. It got a little technical with like, oh, and the fifth going this way, and the fourth one being yellow. But it reminded me in some sense of the Book of Revelation, which just has all these very specific, haunting images. Because ultimately, yeah, this is an image that he's giving. He's leaving us with an image, not with an abstraction. And so in that way, it makes it more human. It makes it more mythical. Makes it more magical. And the last thing I'll talk about here is the soul of Odysseus. So you saw me smiling into the camera as I started to read about the soul of Odysseus who received the last lot. And I started smiling because he talked about so Odysseus was like the greatest soul, and also, it's Homer's hero, so everybody knows about him. And he's kind of taking him out of the Homeric epic and putting it into his own epic. Again, maybe some of this George Lucas, James Cameron rivalry. Like, this time he's like able to like steal the intellectual property of Homer. But who does Odysseus choose to be? It's the private individual who's not well known, who lives a happy life, and says he would choose that life again. For me, that's Cephalus. Okay, that description, I was smiling so much because that just fit the description of Cephalus to a T. And so here we have the greatest hero in all of Greek literature, Odysseus, in some sense reincarnated as Cephalus, the guy we met at the very beginning. So it's, in this sort of mythological reading, it's like we kind of met Odysseus at the beginning. Like, we didn't really know who he was. And that's a very common trope in mythology, is like meeting a famous person but not realizing that they're famous, and then like only realize like, oh, who was that? That was Thomas Jefferson. But yeah, it's almost like we met Odysseus at the beginning of this book, and under the guise of Cephalus, who, you remember, he's just has a happy life, happy to go do his sacrifices in the back, sleeps well at night, and would probably just choose his life all over again. One other thing I was thinking about Cephalus is, you remember that he kind of had found the just life in that he had gotten control of his inner lion and his inner beast. He said specifically, he's like, yeah, I am kind of impotent, but I'm glad to be free of that insane and deranged master. So it's just kind of like old age is another way to like find that inner peace, find that inner justice. And then, you look at like happiness studies, it's like people's happiness peaks at like age 82, and maybe that's part of the reason why. So my fan theory, my fridge horror theory, is that Cephalus is Odysseus, and that for me ties everything together, including all this stuff about Homer, and like him getting all mad about Homer. But I love that there's still this need for mythology, just in the human heart, in our souls, that we need not only a mythology, kind of an abstract mythology, like, oh, the soul's immortal and justice is rewarded, but like we need these visual stories, and they're just so compelling. And I sort of just felt that personally as I was going through this, because before it's like oh yeah, and we tell the Guardian some stuff about Hades and they'll believe it, but it didn't really fully descend from philosophy to literature for me there. Like I didn't feel moved as a human, like, oh yeah, I would believe one of those Hades stories. But this one, man, this one like got me. I just felt like transfixed while I was reading it. And so this is how it finally comes all the way down from the clouds for me into something that's like really personally moving, and I feel kind of connected to anybody else who like reads this and sees those spindles turning, and like Lykesis and Clotho, to like determining the future and us picking our souls, and the souls going into their 1,000-year journey through a hole in heaven, and the other ones are descending down into Hades, and the absolute worst ones, those tyrants who we said would be most miserable on Earth, being tortured and flayed and unable to escape. So that was awesome. Nice work, Plato. I commend you. All right. That's a wrap. I'm just going to stop there. I can't top the Myth of Ur. Go back and reread it. Buy the full version of the book so C.D.C. Reeve doesn't copy strike me. Yeah, hope you enjoyed this series. I'm thank you for everybody who left a comment. Thank you to everybody who left a thumb in the upward direction. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I did this just because of because it's part of the PewDiePie book club. Check it out. Book Clap Review Clap on Reddit. I'll probably add a link to PewDiePie's video once that comes out, but I beat him to the punch here. Feeling pretty good about that. Let me know if you want to do more philosophy or if you'd rather do some fiction. I will recommend again the other books here on the channel. Got Frankenstein for you if you want to go in the demonic direction. That's a word that comes up a lot, the demon. So kind of somewhere between a human and a god. Well, tying it together for you. I've also recommended Brave New World if you want a sort of different take on the perhaps ideal, perhaps nightmare society. And then if you liked writing like this Myth of Ur, I'd recommend The Time Machine, which just has just beautifully rendered images from strange and fantastical worlds. So hopefully those three will keep you busy, and hope I keep having more books here on the channel. Thanks for joining me, and see you down the road.